Welcome everybody to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. Existentialism is an umbrella term covering diverse and often conflicting schools of thought. Consequently, we are not agreed on who or what is an existentialist. We simply agree to disagree. I'm David Miller. I'm the Secretary of the Existentialist Society. And our speaker today is Dr. Desmonda Lawrence, and her topic is Poetry and Philosophy, Martin Heidegger and Paul Celan. Desma, over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to screen share. I've got a PowerPoint presentation to go along with it. You can all see that?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. So hello. Thank you very much for having me. Well, I haven't given a talk for a long time, and but I gave a short lecture series at the MSCP some years ago on the topic of poetry and philosophy broadly, the relationship of those two discourses, and that course collected just a few different sort of moments under the aegis of poetry and philosophy. Or the relationship of poetry and philosophy. So I initially conceived the meeting, the physical meeting, and then the poem that comes from that meeting between Paul Celan and Martin Heidegger as a kind of encounter between the discourses of poetry and philosophy. As well as a specific meeting, quite loaded for reasons that we'll unpack, between this particular poet and this particular philosopher. So I'm really grateful to have been asked to come and speak to you today, and this is what I've decided to pick up for this talk. So I'll be talking a lot about Paul Celan and his poetry, and from there addressing his meeting with Heidegger at Todtnauburg in 1967, and the eponymous poem that Celan wrote recording this meeting. This poem, Todtnauburg, marks an encounter, poetic and philosophical, an encounter that I want to present in the context of a bit of background on Celan and his poetic life, and briefly of his interest in Heidegger. We don't have enough time to go into a lot of detail on that, and the visit between them in the Black Forest. And then once we get to the poem itself, rather than go into a lot of interpretation, I'm going to sort of hand over or open up the discussion. We'll read the poem together, and then we can come back to some notes on some of the critical responses to the poem. But once we get there, it'd be great to hear some responses from you. So my own interest is in the ways in which these discourses, poetry and philosophy, relate to one another. And just to take a few steps back, that interest is informed by the Platonic exclusion of poetry from the Republic. So this is this famous ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry. Now, I was looking back at the abstract that I sent out many months ago, and I noticed that I said in the very first sentence, I quote myself, "The tension between how poetry as art relates to our existence as citizens of a society is stretched to breaking point in Theodor Adorno's famous pronouncement that there can be no poetry after Auschwitz." Okay, so we'll come to Adorno later on, but having characterized art in that opening sentence as having to do with our existence as citizens of a society, I wanted to back up a bit and to start there and to dwell by way of an introduction on that thought. Because I'm not sure when we think about poetry, we firstly do so in terms of our condition as citizens of a state or a society. So one of the things that formulation references is us as citizens of the Republic, that is, of Plato's Republic, the Republic of philosophy, the non-sophistic state, the Socratic state, the state from which poetry has been excised and the poets politely shown to the gates. And it's a formulation suggested by Seamus Heaney in his Oxford Lectures on Poetry. I'm going to quote Heaney at length because his reflections on poetry are part of the way that I want to situate a process of thought about the poetry of Celan and the poem in particular, which bears witness to the meeting with Heidegger. And this encounter between this poet and this philosopher is an encounter that I take to be poetry's encounter, an encounter between the discourses of philosophy and poetry that takes place on poetry's terms. So discussing a different poem and poet, though I'm generalizing Heaney's point here. Heaney says that the poem is a showing forth of the way that poetry brings human existence into a fuller life, and that it is fully alive to the excitements and transformations which poetic activity promotes. So that's on that one there, yeah. Heaney addresses the Platonic injunction against poetry, saying that professors of poetry, apologists for it, practitioners of it, from Sir Philip Sidney to Wallace Stevens, all sooner or later are tempted to show how poetry's existence as a form of art relates to our existence as citizens of a society, how it is of present use. Behind such defences and justifications at any number of removes stands Plato, calling into question whatever special prerogatives or useful influences poetry would claim for itself within the polis. Yet Plato's world of ideal forms also provides the court of appeal through which the poetic imagination seeks to redress whatever is wrong or exacerbating in the prevailing conditions. It is the imagination pressing back against the pressure of reality. So I'm not here prosecuting a particular metaphysical or Platonic or whatever sort of theory of art or aesthetics, just to say that what interests me in Heaney's suggestion is that it gives us a way, maybe a method, to think about poetry as such. The way that poetry brings human existence into a fuller life and the excitements and transformations which poetic activity promotes. Sorry about jumping between slides here, but that's, I think, where that particular quote is. And of course, Martin Heidegger was occupied as a philosopher in the intersection between these discourses, poetry, art, and philosophy, thinking and language, thinking, being. And Celan himself was engaged and interested in Heidegger's work. But, and this is me now, something slightly weird can happen when philosophers talk about poetry in too philosophical a way, in a way that over-philosophizes it, which is a tradition, I think, that's inaugurated by Aristotle in the Poetics, as he argues for the return of poetry into the state of philosophy. So whether we think Heidegger does that is something that we can perhaps take up. But if I have a methodology, it's more focused on the individual encounter, so that the quarrel between philosophy and poetry, or the question of the relation of the discourses, doesn't resolve into a single theory or set of theories or ideas or concepts, but maybe a bit like Immanuel Kant's conception of the aesthetic idea that alights but never settles under a concept. There is the possibility of a multitude of sites of encounter. So the use that I want to make of Heaney's remarks is to provide, if not exactly an interpretive context, then a certain background from which to approach our encounter with Celan and between Celan and Heidegger. Heaney, again, on the imagination. If our given experience is a labyrinth, its impassability can be countered by the poet's imagining some equivalent of the labyrinth and presenting himself and us with a vivid experience of it. Such an operation does not intervene in the actual. It offers a response to reality which has a liberating and verifying effect upon the individual spirit. And coming back to the question of how our encounter with poetry relates to our situation as citizens of a society, Heaney again says, poetry in certain circumstances is understandably pressed to give voice to much that has hitherto been denied expression in the ethnic, social, sexual, and political life, which is to say that its power as a mode of redress, in the first sense, as an agent for proclaiming and correcting injustices, is being appealed to constantly. But in discharging this function, poets are in danger of slighting another imperative, namely to redress poetry as poetry, to set it up as its own category, an eminence established and a pressure exercised by distinctly linguistic means. So I want to particularly take up that formulation of poetry as its own category. The designations Heaney includes, eminence and pressure, are interesting and quite different from what we might get if we're thinking about it in relation, perhaps, say, to Heidegger. But also, I would say, not fixed, so that we could substitute other things there, like for the reading of Tortnauer Borg, that of witness. So that's my preamble, to say that in reading Celan and encountering Tortnauer Borg, my interest is predominantly poetic in Heaney's terms, poetry as poetry that sets up its own category by distinctly linguistic means. Okay, so introducing Paul Celan. The best way to introduce Celan is before diving into a lot of or any biographical information, I think, is to read together just a couple of his short poems. So I hope that that's seeable for you all. I know it's a little bit small. This is called Psalm. No one needs us again out of earth and clay. No one incants our dust. No one. Blessed art thou, no one. In thy sight would we bloom, in thy spite. A nothing we were, are now, and ever shall be, blooming, the nothing, the no one's rose. With our pistil soul bright, our stamen heaven waste, our corolla red, from the purple word we sang over, oh, over the thorn. The next out of three that I want to read just as an introduction to him is Mandorla. These are three of his most well-known poems, so you may have come across them if you've read Celan before. Mandorla. In the almond, what stands in the almond? Nothing. What stands in the almond is nothing. There it stands and stands. In the nothing, what stands there? The king. There the king stands. The king. There he stands and stands. Dews curl, you'll not turn grey. And your eye, what does your eye stand on? On the almond your eye stands. Your eye, on nothing it stands. Stands on the king. To him remains loyal, true. So it stands and stands. Human curl, you'll not turn grey. Empty almond, royal blue. And thread suns. Thread suns above grey-black wilderness. A tree, high thought tunes into light's pitch. There are still songs to be sung on the other side of mankind. So Celan's poetry is itself an encounter. He is a difficult poet, elliptical, hard to follow, and he becomes more and more so as his poetry develops up to his death in 1970. Celan's poetry, I think, above all, asks for an encounter and a kind of attention, a kind of soul attention. And I think the difficulty that we encounter in Paul Celan's poetry is sui generis. So Paul Celan was born Paul Anschel. Sorry, let me just go back there. Paul Anschel, in 1920 in Czernowitz, which was eventually became Romania, right on the edge of the collapsing Habsburg Empire. His poetry before his parents' death in the Shoah reflected a really deep maternal mother and son affection. He started writing poetry when he was 15 or 16. Here's an example or part of a sonnet composed while he was away from home in studying at medical school in 1939. The mother softly healing, keeping near, whose gentle evening fingers brush our skin, clears precious space for us, for the dear who draws in welcome breaths of morning wind. And this is really important, and the reason I put it here, and we'll get to that a little bit further on, but his closeness in his relationship with his mother is very important, not just for the experiences, but the way, the language with which and the way that he develops as a poet. So Paul Anschel grew up in a religious Jewish household. His mother tongue was German, and his mother was very insistent on the speech of High German, of the literary language of Germany. So he was steeped not only in High German literature of Goethe, Schiller, and Hölderlin growing up. He was also steeped deeply in the traditions of Judaic culture. His father was an observant Jew. Okay, so just before we carry on, I'm going to take another small diversion just to talk very briefly about the issue of translation. I was saying to David earlier, I do not read German, unfortunately. So some of you might read German. When we get to the Tordnauerberg, I've given you a German copy as well. So it'd be great to hear from any German speakers, your thoughts. But translation's always a difficult issue. And I just think for poetry, maybe in particular, and I just think it needs to be probably marked that, obviously when you're looking at translations, you're looking at a kind of interpretation. So yeah, I think the thing to say about Celan from what I've read from some of the translators' introductions in the collections of his work that I've got is that translation is particularly complicated with a poet like Celan because of his elliptical verse, his word jamming, his neologisms. I think these things make his poetry quite difficult even for the German reader. In fact, Celan's relationship with the German language, his need to break it up and reassemble it, his need to subvert it, to dislodge syntax and disrupt ordinary meanings, probably does render, according to John Felstner, who's one of his translators, his poetry is in some sense untranslatable. John Felstner, in his literary biography of Celan, writes, to uproot and rewrite Celan in translation runs the risk of alienating an already alien voice. Yet this voice needs translating because of its very obscurity. Often his lines seem only half emerged from shadow, as if recovered from some lost tongue and needing further translation even for native speakers. New or odd or archaic words, ruptured syntax, ellipses, buried allusions, and contradiction fill the poet's true stammered mouth. One other thing to say is that I'm also encouraged by Celan's own lifelong commitment to translation. Celan was a polyglot. He spoke fluently German, Romanian, Hebrew, Ukrainian, Polish, Yiddish, Russian, English, and French. And he translated across languages a lot. Into German, he translated Shakespeare, Marianne Moore, and Emily Dickinson. And I recently learned that he even knew some Portuguese and had tried to translate some Pessoa into German from Portuguese. Right, so Paul Celan lived most of his life in Paris. He arrived there in 1948. But during World War II in Romania in 1941, Paul's family had escaped a wave of deportations. But in June 1942, Bukovina's Romanian governor began assisting the Gestapo in rounding up the Jewish population. On the night of June the 27th, 1942, Paul's parents disappeared while Paul sought refuge elsewhere. He rarely talked about this night, and it's not known exactly how their kidnap occurred. But it seems that Paul was at a gathering of friends, and owing to the curfew, had stayed overnight. Coming home the next morning, his parents were gone, and he never saw either of them again. What is known is that they were transported to work on roads and in gravel pits, that his father was removed to southeastern France in September 1942, and he probably died from typhus that same year. And Paul learned his mother's fate from a relative that sometime in late 1942 or early 1943, during an extremely cold winter, she had been shot as unfit for work. Now, Paul, given the disappearance of his parents and his not being there, suffered his whole life from an intense sense of guilt. But obviously also, yeah, this loss was really devastating, and in the context of the Shoah extreme. Here is a part of a poem that he wrote on finding out about his mother's death. It's falling, mother, snow in Ukraine, the Saviour's crown, 1,000 grains of grief. Here all my tears reach out to you in vain. One proud mute glance is all of my relief. Paul himself, during the war years, was forced to join a Labour battalion run by the Romanian army and spent the rest of the war years in a Labour camp in Romania, shoveling rocks and road building. He never spoke really much about what happened to him there. And when asked about that time, he really said that the only thing he said was shoveling. And the motifs of shoveling, digging, and rocks recur continually in his poetry. So that's something to note when you're reading him. As the Red Army pushed west in 1944, Paul either escaped or was released. He returned home to Cernovitz, which the Soviets had reoccupied, but eventually he had to leave. He fled to Hungary, then to Vienna, and eventually arrived in Paris in 1948. In 1952, he married Giselle Lestrange, who was from an aristocratic French family. Throughout his life, Celan wrote about 800 poems from 1938 to 1970. Also of really great interest to some of his writings on poetry. For example, the George Büchner lecture that he gave entitled Meridian, when he received the Büchner Prize. Celan died by suicide in 1970. It is, of course, significant, extremely significant, that Celan wrote all of his poetry in the German language. This was the language of his mother tongue, and also the language of the murderers of his family. So the linguistic production of his body of work is itself a testament to his exile. He'd come to France from a homeland that hardly existed anymore, wrote in German for an audience that he did not live among or trust, and he had a lifelong fraught relationship with Germany and the German people. He felt that there were a lot of guest collaborators who had just been allowed to melt back into German society, and he was hyper aware of the rise of neo-Nazism, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background. Coming to Theodor Adorno then, and his famous statement about poetry no longer being possible after Auschwitz, which I guess is important because, you know, famously, Paul Celan's work has often been read or offered as a kind of refutation of Adorno's assertion, and was recognized by Adorno himself later on. So, Adorno argued that the catastrophe of the Nazi years represented an historical caesura. From now on, he thought it was impossible to just continue, as though the collapse of civilization were a limited national aberration, allowing some kind of eventual return to normalcy. Everything had to be radically rethought: philosophy, politics, codes of behavior, as well as art and culture in the widest sense. Adorno writes on the last page of his essay, Cultural Criticism and Society, written in 1949, even the most extreme consciousness of doom threatens to degenerate into idle chatter. Cultural criticism finds itself faced with the final stage of the dialectic of culture and barbarism. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, and this corrodes even the knowledge of why it has become impossible to write poetry today. Now, Adorno, who himself had fled the Nazi regime in 1934, was arguing that artistic forms were unable to avoid distorting the unimaginable experiences of victims and survivors, and that art was doomed only to fall into disfigurement of truth. Now, Adorno did eventually revise this view. Later in Aesthetic Theory, he wrote that, far from being barbaric after the horrors of the Holocaust, I quote here, art may be the only remaining medium of truth in an age of incomprehensible suffering. As the real world grows dark, the irrationality of art is becoming rational, especially at a time when art is radically tenebrous itself. And in Negative Dialectics, he writes, perennial suffering has as much right to expression as the tortured have to scream. Hence, it may have been wrong to say that after Auschwitz, you can no longer write poems. But it is not wrong to ask the less cultural question of whether after Auschwitz you can go on living, especially whether one who has escaped by accident, one who by rights should have been killed, may go on living. His mere survival calls for the coldness, the basic principle of bourgeois subjectivity, without which there could have been no Auschwitz. This is the drastic guilt of him who was spared. By way of atonement, he will be plagued by dreams, such as that he is no longer living at all, that he was sent to the ovens in 1944, and that his whole existence since then has been imaginary, an emanation of the insane wish of a man killed 20 years earlier. So sorry, that's quite full on, isn't it? I think it's really really important for in view of Celan because of this idea of the drastic guilt of him who was spared. I think that drastic guilt infuses Celan's poetry and life. And as we know, Celan eventually suicided, but he had very difficult mental health and was very ill for a lot of, especially the last few years of his life. So whether or not he wanted to be a model for how art responds, how it bears witness and attests to the survival of the human spirit, Celan's writing was a working through, often and largely individual, sometimes lonely and hermetic, but at the same time, a kind of universal reaching out to the world with the pain and the loss through what he called the death-bringing speech. And the death-bringing speech is the German language, to create something new, something that did not go around, but through the catastrophe. So in the high modernism of artists like Schoenberg, Beckett, and Celan, Adorno found models for how art could nevertheless respond to this cultural, political, and spiritual predicament. For Celan, to write poetry after Auschwitz was to survive. He gave almost no factual testimony of his life in the war years. His poetry was his testimony. He wrote, "With art, go into your very self-most straits and set yourself free." Celan called the European Jewish catastrophe that which happened, insisting that it is not just an addition to history, but a metamorphosis. For Celan, writing his lyrics in German was a necessity, and yet it posed an impossible problem, since the Thousand-Year Reich organized its genocide of Europe's Jews by means of language, propaganda, slogans, slurs, pseudoscientific dogma. For a man who was, in one way or another, in permanent exile, the German language was his own native land. It was his mother tongue, the language of his mother, the language of her murderers, those of his family and of the Jews of Europe, the murderers of his family and the Jews of Europe. For Celan, the German language itself had been damaged, and his verse might repair that damage, but language and poetry would have to change, to be transformed. He tried to create a poetry that, as he said, thought through and out of its time, thought it through to its end. But his poems, he said, had to pass through the 1,000 darknesses of death-bringing speech. And Celan always had to wrestle with the problem, the question that he closed a poem entitled Nearness of Graves with, written in 1944. Oh yeah, that's it. Sorry there. And can you bear, mother, as, oh, at home, once on a time, the gentle, the German, the pain-laden rhyme? In an essay composed while he was in Vienna in 1947, he wrote that the task is to never leave the depths and keep holding dialogue with the dark well springs. So this dialogue with the dark well springs is how what is new can be brought up and brought out in his work. In a speech, he calls poems paths on which language gets a voice. They're encounters, paths of a voice to a perceiving thou. And these paths are in search of oneself, a kind of homecoming. So that's a really poignant and interesting and important way of thinking, all the way through all of that to a kind of homecoming. All right, I think we should look at Todesfuge, which is probably, if you know Celan at all, you will know this poem. And again, I'm sorry that that's very small. If you can squint up to your computer and see that, but I will read it out. It's even possible that the one that I'm reading is a slightly different translation, so that doesn't matter. That can be interesting. This is Celan's most famous and most anthologized poem, and it became a sort of benchmark for poetry after Auschwitz. And in a way, it sort of haunted Celan for the rest of his life. It was written around 1945. Is that right? Yep. Michael Hamburger writes that Todesfuge is perhaps the only decisive proof that poems could not only be written after Auschwitz, but that the horrors perpetrated there could be written about. His remark that Celan wrote the poem from, Hamburger's remark that Celan wrote the poem from direct experience isn't quite right. As we know, Celan wasn't in a concentration camp, but there are, and we think that Celan probably had heard about, I'll just quickly show you this picture, the situation in concentration camps of music being played at particularly horrific moments. I'll come back to that in a minute. So here's the poem, Todesfuge or Death Fugue. Black milk of morning, we drink you at dusk time. We drink you at noontime and dawn time. We drink you at night. We drink and drink. We scoop out a grave in the sky where it's roomy to lie. There's a man in this house who cultivates snakes, who writes when it's nightfall, nach Deutschland, your golden hair, Margarita. He writes it and walks from the house, and the stars are all flashing. He whistles his dogs to draw near, whistles his Jews to appear, starts us scooping a grave out of sand. He commands us play up for the dance. Black milk of morning, we drink you at night, we drink you at dawn time and noontime, we drink you at dusk time, we drink and we drink. There's a man in this house who cultivates snakes and who writes when it's nightfall, nach Deutschland, your golden hair, Margarita, your ashen hair, Shulamite. We scoop out a grave in the sky where it's roomy to lie. He calls, jab it deep in the soil, you lot. There, you other men, sing and play. He tugs at the sword in his belt, he swings it, his eyes are blue. Jab your spades deeper, you men, you others, play up for the dance. Black milk of morning, we drink you at night. We drink you at noontime and dawn time. We drink you at dusk time. We drink and drink. There's a man in this house, your golden hair, Margarita, your ashen hair, Shulamite. He cultivates snakes. He calls, play that death thing more sweetly. Death is a gang boss, auch Deutschland. He calls, scrape that fiddle more darkly, then hover like smoke in the air, then scoop out a grave in the clouds where it's roomy to lie. Black milk of morning, we drink you at night, we drink you at noontime. Death is a gang boss, ach Deutschland. We drink you at dusk time and dawn time. We drink and drink. Death is a gang boss, aus Deutschland. His eye is blue. He shoots you with leaden bullets. His aim is true. There's a man in this house, your golden hair, Margarita. He sets his dogs on our trail. He gives us a grave in the sky. He cultivates snakes and he dreams. Death is a gang boss, auch Deutschland. Your golden hair, Margarita. Your ashen hair, Shulamite. If you ever get a chance, even if you don't speak or understand German, there is a recording of Paul Celan reading this poem in German that you can find on YouTube, and I highly suggest that you watch it. Yeah, someone's got a crying emoji there. Yeah. Sorry, this is a very heavy topic for a Saturday afternoon, but this is an amazing poem. So some early reviewers complained that the frightening and monstrous metaphor of black milk, graves in the air, hair of ash, and dancers played for grave diggers embellished the spectacle of the death camps. But most of these elements really are not metaphors at all. They're just facts learned by Celan after talking to survivors and hearing stories that came out of Auschwitz. Celan once remarked that Todesfuge arose from something he'd read about Jews being forced to play dance tunes in a Nazi camp. There is documentation of this happening, and there's one quite famous picture of that. A few things to take note of in the composition: the terrible rhythm, the musicality, the tempo, the rhythm of attrition, the turn and return, which feels like a spinning out of control. But the repetition also closes in on the day-to-day repetition of camp life, evoking a kind of senseless, inescapable cycle. It's a first-person direct address that seems to speak directly to the reader out of a Nazi camp. Celan assumes the voice, both of the Jews speaking for them at their most hellish moments, but also of the Nazis as well. He lets the Jews speak, then he lets them speak the orders of the soldiers. So these juxtapositions of voice, the harsh orders of the master against the cloying romantic sentimentality of the master's fixation on the golden hair of his sweetheart. It also pairs Marguerite, the heroine of Goethe's Faust, against Shulamite, from the Song of Songs, usually dark-haired, but here, tellingly, her hair is ashen grey. Celan was very sensitive to the reception of this poem and continued to be, and in 1965, when Adorno published or republished his essay calling it barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz, Celan took it personally. They knew each other. I don't know if I mentioned that, but Celan and Adorno had some correspondence during their lifetimes. So for Celan, as a survivor of that which happened, Poetry that has to be written after Auschwitz, has to remain conscious of the horror of the Shoah. But poetry can't simply bear witness to the past. It must also at the same time be resolutely turned to the future. Sorry, I just thought I might go back to a slightly different picture while I read the next bit. Poetry has to be open and imaginatively engaged with a production and a construction of a new world. It has to look forward and it has to be visionary. Celan is a modern poet, but I think of Celan's modernism not as primarily an aesthetic of poetics, but as a poetics of humanity. To borrow the words of the Scottish poet Kenneth White, the poet is not concerned with art, but with reality. But reality for Celan is no longer served by realism or by traditional aesthetics or modes of poetry. As Celan develops as a poet, his work becomes more difficult, more elliptical, and more abstract. When asked about the difficulty, I'm just going to put up a couple of very short samples of some of Celan's later work. When asked about the difficulty of his especially later poems, Celan insisted that they were not hermetic, and that all one had to do was read them again and again. And he also claimed that for poetry today, or his poetry, that opacity was a kind of necessity. In a note towards the Meridian, which, as I mentioned, is the speech that he gave accepting the George Bushner Prize, he writes that the darkness of the poem is constitutive, that the poem is born dark, that it is a result of radical individuation. It is born as a piece of language, and that as far as language manages to be world, it is loaded with world. This is very Heideggerian, you might notice, kind of language, actually. This is a kind of world making, a desire, again in Celan's words, to make it new or to make it again. Celan's work demands an encounter and an attentiveness and a willingness on behalf of the reader, the hearer, to be puzzled, to let understanding slip in diagonally, you might say, in through the ellipses, the silences, the spaces, and the paradoxes. And I would say that what Celan also gives us as modern readers, modern in terms of where we are now even, is a reminder that in a world glutted with speech, a world that is quite afraid of silence, a world in which every possible silence is filled, he reminds us of the importance of silence and of hesitation, of the interval of hesitation and contemplation, where first the mind speaks internally and where in the unconscious, in the imagination, rules are different. Images are not finally resolved into, or necessarily resolved into sequences of sense making, where, like Circe in Ulysses, the mind does not distinguish between dream and wakefulness, or between the imaginary and the real. So as we read him and as his poetics develops, structures of meaning build up around and in between certain symbolic recurrences, images that resound and reverberate throughout all of his work, sort of teach us and induct us into his poetics. Some that occur frequently are wells and water almonds, botanical references. Celan's knowledge of botany was encyclopedic, and in a way, the botanical references give the power of naming back. His use of botanical naming stands in for so much that cannot be said, gives him the capacity to orient himself, a soul often at sea in the dark, in the bright world of plants and of things that grow, things that make it new, things that exist. So, yes, all right. So Celan wrote a letter to his close friend and fellow poet Nellie Sachs, saying, all things are unforgotten. And Felsner points up this as a way of reading him, that his poetry, his imagery is cumulative. His poetry demands an exhaustively attentive reader, a rereader, an engagement that circles and cycles through and back and through and back. In his Büchner Prize speech, published as Meridians, I've mentioned, he references a story from a story written by George Büchner in 1836 called Lens, which is a really strange, surreal short story about a poet who sets off into the mountains, and which begins with the line, on the 20th of January, this date is coincidentally the date of the Wannsee Conference in 1943, when the final solution was decided. So on the 20th of January, Lenz walked through the mountains, only it sometimes troubled him that he could not walk on his head. So that's how Büchner's story begins. On January the 20th, Lenz walked through the mountains, only it sometimes troubled him that he could not walk on his head. Celan comments that whoever walks on his head has heaven as an abyss beneath him. And he cites heaven as an abyss as grounds for his poetry's obscurity. Michael Hamburger writes, Celan's extremism in his late work hinges on the question of what can be said or no longer said in poetry. If he has written anti-poems, his anti-poems are far removed as possible from the low mimetic. Ordinary language will not serve him. His diction vacillates between archaism and neologism. His images are plainly generic. Stone is a recurrent one, yet their connections are cryptically idiosyncratic. Again and again in his later poems, language grills, comes up against the unspeakable. Silences and hiatuses are part of what they render and enact. Yet, in their own inimitable and difficult way, Celan's poems are attempts to communicate, ways of a voice to a receptive you, as he put it once, a desperate dialogue and a sort of homecoming. As his nerves and his mental health deteriorated, his poetics became increasingly insistently minimalist, alogical and elliptical, working through paradox. The poetry of Breath Turn from 1965 and the work from around 1966, which became Thread Suns, some of the poetry is, in Felsner's words, so cryptic they seem to be signals from another planet. And here are just a couple of short. They're quite they're quite broken up at this point. A mother stump leads a budding face through a pane. Its God mows past, reviving images on the crests of the highest cradle. Near in the aorta's arch, in bright blood, the bright wood. Mother Rachel weeps no more, carried across now, all of the weeping, still in the coronary arteries, unbridled, ziv, that light. And because you found the trouble shard in a wilderness place, the shadow centuries relax beside you, and here you think, perhaps it's true that peace conjured two peoples here out of clay vessels. So there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot in all of the poetry. There's a lot in these short lyrics for the reader to grapple with. But I think we can't be in their presence without feeling their power and without feeling the danger and the effect of language kind of falling apart. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, necessarily the power of what we find is partly in the spaces and in the collisions. In Felsner's words, in this late poetry, we hear the anchorite struggling with the language left to him. And Emmanuel Levinas said that Celan's poems revealed insomnia in the bed of being. That's here. Revealed insomnia in the bed of being. I should have written that down. That's a good one. Because it brings us nicely as a segue to briefly discuss Heidegger and then have a look at the poem that was written by Celan after their encounter. So I'm not going to say much about Heidegger. I'm not going to, it'll be to your relief, I think, that I'm not going to give you a lecture on Heidegger's philosophy, particularly if you know Heidegger's work, you'll know that there's a lot of crossover and that there's a lot that you've probably been able to see from just what we've looked at with Celan that will be of interest. But obviously, you know, the difficult thing is, and the difficult part of this meeting is going to be to do with Heidegger's history as well. So Celan and Heidegger had some correspondence with one another. Celan was very interested in Heidegger's work. He'd read Being and Time, and Heidegger was appreciative too of Celan's work. And at one stage, Heidegger had said, you know, I know everything that he's written. Other of Heidegger's writings on art and poetry and language were clearly of interest to Celan, and judging by the markings that he made on several copies or books of Heidegger's that were found amongst his effects, the essay in particular, What Are Poets For?, seems to have spoken to Celan with unusual force in its elaboration on the role of the poet. According to a sentence that Celan had underlined, that role was to attend singing to the trace of the fugitive gods. Celan highlighted numerous other passages in this particular essay. One explained the poet's activity as a special speaker with an almost sacred calling, and another posits the poet's role as a seer, a concept that Celan obviously found related to his vocation. Poets, Heidegger claimed, are repositories of all that is seen or has been seen, which means that this seer is also the one who possesses a special kind of knowledge. And since knowledge is the memory of being, and memory is the mother of muses, this concept relates or resonates with Celan, who was interested, and his poetry was always interested in remembering and memorializing. So there is a long and sporadic engagement on the part of Celan with Heidegger's work, which is actually traced in immense detail in a book by John Leon. I'll show you at the end in case you're interested. And he literally goes through all of Celan's papers and details things that Celan had read and some responses and conversations and letters and all sorts of different ways that Celan was engaged with the thinking of Heidegger. But also, you know, importantly, that there was a certain cognitive dissonance for Celan caused by his admiration for Heidegger's works. And obviously that's related to his indignation over Heidegger's Nazi past and his failure to ever speak about that publicly in the years following the war and the Holocaust. So yes, the real difficulty for Celan comes from Heidegger's failure to ever really address his Nazi affiliation. So the two men met on July the 24th in 1967. Celan had been at that point suffering very greatly, had been institutionalized and was out of I'm trying to think what it's called, the sanatorium, had gone to Freiburg to deliver a reading, one of the most significant in terms of amount of poems that he read that he ever gave. Heidegger attended that, and of course, you know, during the Nazi years, Heidegger was the rector at Freiburg University, so that's significant. And then the two met after the reading. I think Celan declined to be photographed with Heidegger at the time, but was invited the next day to Heidegger's little hut in the Black Forest at Tortnauburg. And so that meeting is what gives rise to, what's my next slide? Oh yeah, we can come back to that. That meeting is what gives rise to the poem Tortnauburg, which documents, in which Celan documents that time that they spent together. It's not really known exactly what was said or what wasn't said. There's quite a bit of scholarly debate about exactly whether Celan's experience was negative or whether, due to the difficulties that he was having at the time, he may have later on reinterpreted the experience as negative. I think we can come back to most of that. I've been talking for a pretty long time, and there is I have some notes that go into a little bit of detail about some of the readings of that poem, but I think actually if everyone wants to do that, we might take a look at the poem together. So what my proposition is this is obviously Heidegger. This is obviously the little hut, Heidegger's Hütte in the Black Forest, and this is Heidegger standing next to the well, which comes up in the poem. So my proposal now is that I read the poem, and then I think at this point at an hour, I mean, I'd like to open up for some discussion, rather than just sort of give a reading of the poem myself. It would be really great to hear some of your responses. Perhaps, you know, if we can work through the poem a little bit together, we can come back to some of my critical interpretive notes later if those things come up. So how does that sound as a way forward?
Okay.
All right, great. So this then is the much mythologized poem Todtnauborg, written very soon after the two men met, right? Arnica Eyebright, the draught from the well with the star dye on top, in the Hütte, written in the book, whose name did it record before mine? In this book, the line about a hope today for a thinker's word to come in the heart. Forest sward unlevelled, Orcus and Orcus singly, raw exchanges later while driving clearly. He who drives us, the mensch, he also hears it. The half-trod log trails on the high moor, humidity much. So just what I will say, I suppose, is that in comparison actually to some of what Celan had been writing at this time, it doesn't come across as being nearly as elliptical. But let's hear if anybody would like to offer. And the other thing I want to say too, I mentioned that I don't read German, but you do have the German text there. So if you are a German reader and you want to comment on the translation or anything that comes through for you, reading it in German, that would be also really welcomed. So yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Desmonda Lawrence, for your presentation. Now, before we throw the meeting open to questions, comments, and discussion with Desma, I've a couple of announcements. The first of which is that the next Existentialist Society lecture discussion will take place in 1 month's time, on the 7th of December. If you're in Australia, that is. But in North America, it would be the Friday evening prior. And John Rubin will be addressing us on love, castration, and necessity, the philosophy and letters of Heloise and Abelard. I'll just read that again. Love, castration, and necessity, the philosophy and letters of Heloise and Abelard. Now, the Existentialist Society has weekly meetups where we promote the activities of other associated groups. So if you're interested in seeing what these topics are week by week, the Existentialist Society's meetup page, the link to which I've just put up in the chat. Now, for our questions, comments, and discussions section, we'll use the raised hand method, and you'll find the raised hand icon in the React tab at the bottom of your screen. So in that way, we'll be able to get you to speak in turn, and I will unmute you when it's your turn to speak. So, Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just looking at the translation here, and I noticed that that in the third stanza it reads, "For a thinker's word to come," whereas in the German it would read, "For a thinker's coming word." That would be a better translation, I think. And also in the fifth stanza you have raw exchanges where the word crude is clearly crude in German. It'd be crude exchanges. I mean,
that's well
German.
picked up. Sorry, that's well picked up. Actually, some translations, there are lots of different translations of this around, and some translations do translate that word as crude rather than raw. Yes, well, we can come back to. I mean, the issue of for a thinker's word to come in the heart is, or for a thinker's word to come is really quite important, because probably that's, you know, the really central kernel of this is what Celan is hoping for and expecting, you know, to come out of this exchange.
Yeah. So anyway, the reason I draw attention to the word raw as opposed to crude, crude I think is more appropriate, because I thought there was a moment there that it had to do with the man that was driving the car overhearing a crude exchange that was not expressed between Celan and Heidegger, but a rude exchange with someone who was in the car, and Celan is anxious about him overhearing something that was said about Heidegger or something like that. That's the way that I imagine the scene. So that's why I noticed the word raw as opposed to crude. But that's the only remark I have to make at this point.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll just quickly respond to that, just so that as we build up a picture of what the poem documents. I mean, no one really knows exactly, but the general reading of it is that, you know, Celan did approach Heidegger and in some way address the question of Heidegger's Nazi association, and some of the commentators seem to think that it is the person who's driving the car that is overhearing that exchange. So that's one common reading of that section there.
Thank you, Robert. John, go ahead.
Yes, just a couple of points. He was a Jew in a German context, but it's interesting, in Australia, there are many Jews, many Australians who had German background. And I'm just thinking back while you were doing this talk that we experienced a sort of an ambivalence that we, you know, we had this idea of the German high culture, of the music, of Bach, Beethoven, of literature, Schiller, of the Goethe and whatnot. And yet at the same time, we had to face the fact that our street signs had been changed because of the negative impact of the early Germans, Kaiser, and then of Hitler in the Second World War. So we went through a sort of a real ambivalence ourselves. And of course, this what you're presenting here today is an ambivalence between the German and the Jewish. Now, I was interested that he felt he wasn't dealing with aesthetic or art, but with reality. And that's interesting because, of course, Plato dealt with the form, the ideal, over against the formulation of the reality. I'm just wondering whether the hermeneutic or the aesthetic was perhaps a present future. You know, he was always concerned about doing something better. The past revealed such agony with the Holocaust. Was his aesthetic perhaps present and always in terms of a type of an ideal future. Certainly the Hermetic principle is very very ambivalent in the sense of present, and the below is the above, is like the as a below, so above. So very idealistic. I'm just wondering if you know, if that what sort of aesthetic did he have? I guess that's what I'm really asking.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't say a Platonic one exactly. I mean, part of the reason, or part of the point of looking forward, or you know, of recreating something new, I think for Celan necessitates not circumventing but coming through, you know, what and really working through and dealing with and kind of holding what has come before, you know, the horror. And so that's the whole thing about the German language. I mean, he didn't even grow up in Germany. He grew up in a I mean, his mother spoke German, so they spoke it at home. But where he grew up, they spoke Romanian. So, you know, he makes this very specific choice that the German language, the only way that he can sort of work through the trauma, and not just the personal trauma, but actually the trauma, the collective trauma, and the trauma of the language is to use it, but not use it naively, not sort of by kind of romantically putting it back together, but really by kind of tearing it open somehow. I don't think that really answers your question. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's, you know, a lot to say about what kind of aesthetic Celan is engaged in, but I think I would just probably come back to, well, it wasn't really a theory, but my point at the beginning about the poem as poem, you know, what's interesting about Plato and the whole question of the way that Plato treats poetry is that it's always somehow put up against or in service of philosophy, or measured against philosophy. And in a way, aesthetics does that too, because, you know, when you start theorizing about aesthetics, you're kind of more in the realm of philosophical questions about what art is. And while I do think Celan was interested in those questions, and I think the interest that he had in Heidegger was, you know, a deep interest in what Heidegger was saying about the core of philosophy, which is the question of being, you know, the question of the nature of being, and how language speaks being. And, you know, Heidegger thought that poetry in particular spoke being. So, yeah, that's a really interesting confluence. And I don't know how, you know, how exactly where you park that with the two of them. Yeah. But in terms of this particular poem, I mean, it's really interesting because, you know, like I said, compared to some of the more elliptical poetry that we looked at from his later years, this is almost a straightforward documentation of you know, a meeting. I mean, you can see he's discussing the flowers that are there. He's talking about the well, there are the flowers, you know, there's the well that is on Heidegger's property. He's talking about I'll just go back to that one. This comment here, into the hut book, looking at the well star with a hope for a coming word in the heart. This is the translation of, but these are the words that Celan actually wrote in the visitor's book, at Heidegger's hut. So as you can see, they've been put into the poem in almost verbatim. And then, you know, there's the telling of a walk that they tried to have that was interrupted because the ground was too wet. There was a conversation that happened in the car. So, you know, like, obviously it's sliced up a little bit, and there's probably quite a lot to say, and different critics sort of, you know, argue quite a bit about to what extent this is highly metaphorical, or to what extent it really is just quite simply you know, a record. But yeah, so I don't know, that probably doesn't really answer your question, but it is really interesting to think about the way that Celan's aesthetics have worked throughout his whole writing life and his oeuvre, and in particular how they kind of coalesce here into something that maybe is, you know, in a way a bit more close to reality.
Yeah, I'll keep thinking about it. Thank you very much.
Me too.
Thank you, John. Neville, it's your turn.
Thank you, David. In humility much, and thank you very much for the presentation. In humility much, I'm a dabbler. And so I wanted to ask a question about the silence that poets discuss. They discuss both silence and noise. So in this sort of relationship to the horrific history and memory, where there is silence, and in Wittgenstein's remark about what one cannot speak of, it needs to be silent, in terms of embracing mystery.
Is that, yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, Wittgenstein, I think Wittgenstein was really talking about the edges of what we can speak about as philosophers. Wittgenstein famously, one of my favorite stories about Wittgenstein is that he went to the Vienna Circle where they were all, discussing his philosophy. And he refused to partake in the discussion, but he turned his back on the group and he read the poetry of Rabindranath Tagore to himself, and so, I mean, I think that for Wittgenstein, poetry is one of the ways that we can speak about, so poetry is, I mean, it's not silence completely as in, it's not completely mute, but yeah, it's, what we can't speak about, we must pass over in silence, I think is a philosophical injunction rather than a poetic one. So, I mean, there is, like I said at the beginning too, I don't think like I was talking about the encounter between poetry and philosophy, but, it's not my instinct to, I'm a very bad philosopher in this way. It's not my instinct to resolve things into one set of theories, really. I think what's interesting is a series of encounters. And I think if you're talking about the poetics of silence, if you wanted to call it that, that comes through different poets and different poetic traditions in different ways. But I think in Celan, there are these sort of conceptual aporias which, reading him is hard because I think one or two poems doesn't really get you there. It is true that he said that, you need to read him over and over and over again. But yeah, his work creates its own sort of interpretive, I want to say mythology, but I don't think that's the right word. But I'll say his work creates its own sort of poetic genre. And in fact, let's say his work creates its own kind of aesthetic. And so I think you have to, as a reader, be attuned to those silences. And it's not a very easy thing to didactically kind of declare this is how you would do it, or this is how you would write it, or even this is what it means. And I think that's one of the things that makes that whole question of how you interpret poetry a little bit, like, brings a little bit outside of the academic sphere. I mean, it's not that you can't say anything academic about it. There's lots that you can say about it. But there's also something really interesting about just the experience of it. Yeah, I don't know if that.
Okay, thank you, Neville. Anna, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. For me, the most important thing about reading this is I'm thinking about the flowers and the analogy that the flowers sort of have with stars, and then also, and that's like the ultimate high altitude sort of things. And then we've got water, and not only water, but underground water. So we've got this kind of altitude question with things that are very high and things that are literally under the ground. So that's the first thing that occurs to me. And people should know that Arnica, Eyebright, and Orchis, she did show us the photographs that those are flowers. And then there's a couple of references in the poem about sort of civilization, you know, because you have a forest sword that is unleveled. So that's some wilderness, you know, like what Heidegger was interested in, that kind of black forest wildness, and then also the half-trod log trails. So you've got this sort of middle ground of things that are sort of civilized and sort of uncivilized, this kind of middle ground between this very high, you know, starry thing and this very sort of low, primitive, unconscious underground water element. So I think that's very interesting. But the other thing that really strikes me, we should know, and this is probably reading too much into it, we should know the word orchid, orchis, comes from the Greek word for testicle. So
Oh, that's
this
great.
is,
I
yeah,
did not know that.
2 sets of balls. You know, both these guys have a lot of balls in their own way, kind of confronting each other, you know. So that thought occurs to me, and I doubt if that's really intentional in the poem, but it's kind of there a little bit, you know, because this is a meeting of great minds, on some kind of level ground where they find that they can, at least momentarily, you know, meet each other across what is really a vast gap, considering the politics of the situation. So yeah, I think that's interesting. And then the mensch is sort of the human element there, who's just kind of outside of this in a way, as an observer, you know. Well, anyway, that's what I have to say about it.
Oh, thanks, Anna. Those are some really great thoughts. I really appreciate that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like the significance of the arnica and eyebright too, it needs to be said. Both of those are healing plants. So, you know, arnica's for bruising, and eyebright was used in a kind of balm that Celan remembers from his childhood, actually. So that's important. I did not know the reference of orchis and orchis related to testicles. It's hard to think, though, that Celan wouldn't have known that, you know, being who he was. And I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting interpretive question that you know, as readers of poetry and literature, we constantly face. Like, when you find things like that, is it deliberate? Is it not? And even if it is not, does that make it interpretively insignificant? You know, I don't think it necessarily does. And that, of course, revolves around the question of what the intention of the author is, and how, you know, how that relates to what sometimes is there or happens in a text once, you know, because, yeah, it sort of is written and it is then put out into the world. I do really like the reference that you made to water and deep water in the well and the unconscious. I have to say that I hadn't really thought that far down, and I think that's great. And interestingly, like, one of the things that a lot of commentators have pointed out is that arnica is yellow and there's a star dye on top of the well, which you can just see there. Now, it's obviously not a Star of David, but, you know, it seems to be a common interpretation of the poem that the star in the yellow relates to the star that Jews were made to wear. But the other thing to think about is that stars feature a lot throughout Celan's poetry. And you mentioned the depth and the height, and I think, you know, you can think of stars as going even further. So yeah, I really like that observation that you made there. Yeah, thanks. Great.
you.
Do you want to respond, Anna? No. Okay, Stephen, it's your turn.
Thanks a lot for your talk, Desmonda. I was just wondering that other angle, the war against silence. I mean, you know, I was just thinking last week in the supermarket, there it goes, the radio plays on. You get in the car with somebody, put on the radio. I enjoy silence. And, you know, if I walk into a shop, you know, you might find a nice antique store or a bookshop, that secondhand bookstore that doesn't have any radio play going on. But maybe you can enlighten me into the depths of the war against silence, because I haven't given it a great deal of thought, and I'm wondering what you might have to say on it.
Oh, the war against silence. I'm not sure that I can enlighten you very much about that. Is it a new thing? That's because I sort of did put it that way when I was talking. And yeah, I mean, we are living in a time where there is just this so much media chatter and so much chatter. And I think I can't enlighten you on necessarily what the origins of any of that are really, except to say things that you probably already think yourself, which might be that as we have become sort of more, let's say, media and social media focused, our span of attention has reduced. And so, that has, I think, to do with not being able to sort of live comfortably and cope with moments of, moments outside of all of that chatter, I guess I'd say. And that's definitely getting worse in some ways. But I think, yeah, this is for me one of the things that poetry does, or, some of the other engagement that I would have with literature really, is that it brings you into a place where not in the kind of sense of being able to ignore the world. I think there's a really, and I spoke a little bit about that in what that quote from Seamus Heaney about poetry often being pulled in the direction of serving a kind of purpose, whether that's got to do with politics or sexuality or whatever, but also sort of counterbalancing that with poetry and art existing in a space that gives us just a buffer between us and the world, and in that place, thus buffered, we have an opportunity to have a sort of slightly deeper experience of our humanity. And I think that's becoming more and more difficult in what you called that war on silence, so we should all be reading more poetry. That's what I would say, or something like that. Yeah, but I do think reading Celan, you are, yeah, you kind of find yourself in a place that that a lot of what the rest of the world, in its busyness and in its chatter, doesn't offer. And I feel that those spaces are increasingly important. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I certainly feel like it's something that helps us deeply.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
George, your turn.
Yes, hello. I'm listening to this, and I'm listening to his life, and even this notion of what a war on silence. And so what I can't help but think about, okay, is first and foremost, what's lost to us in 2024 is that after World War II, there was an amazing silence on the Holocaust. The Holocaust was not something that was, at the center, as we might understand it today, of popular culture. And so, indeed, the idea you mentioned that, and one of the reasons the Holocaust was sort of buried, in a sense, in the West, was precisely because a lot of Nazis were incorporated into the German state, after World War II. And so, again, I'm wondering how much of this man is struggling with this fact. And in 1907, I know he committed suicide quite tragically, and he struggled with mental health questions. And I'm going to say this, and this is what I think of. Okay, I'm going to share this. Okay, which is, I know that Hannah Arendt specifically decried the 1967 appropriation of the West Bank and Gaza. And again, I can't help but think, I'm wondering, and again, I don't think there's even anything obvious in this poetry that says this to me, but I'm really wondering if he's struggling with post-World War II events, including, the creation of Israel. And again, I'm just speculating. I'm listening to this. I'm thinking about this. This is what comes to mind as I'm listening to this, and I have no reason to think that he is necessarily, but I'm wondering, even this notion that, you know, poetry cannot be done anymore, sort of end of history. But, you know, what happens after the war is that, you know, crimes continue, right? Crimes continue. And again, I'm going to say, you know, crimes against the Palestinians. I'm going to invoke that. And so, you know, again, I'm wondering, you know, again, reading this man, looking at this man's life, you know, again, I'm wondering how much of this had roles in his, not necessarily, I mean, poetry, okay, but more of his psychological makeup, of his of the torture that he lived with. Again, I'm reading it into this, of the torture that he lived with in terms of post World War II, et cetera, and so forth. I don't know if I have any thoughts on this, but these are as I'm listening to you, these are the things that run through my mind.
Yeah, thanks, George. There's a lot there. I'll pick up on one or two of those points. I mean, firstly, let me just say that when you started talking, the first thing I thought was, yes, well, you're quite right. There are some silences that are not good. So, you know, and actually that does bring us back to this poem, because what this poem really is about, or one of the important things that it's about, is the silence of Heidegger, you know, at the end, after the war, until his death. He never spoke publicly about his relationship to or role in the Nazi Party. And it seems like what Celan wanted following this meeting was for Heidegger to say, at least this is the view of some scholars and critics, was that assuming a conversation happened privately between the two of them, that Celan wanted Heidegger to then make that public, you know, because he felt obviously that would make a really big difference to healing, to signaling to a lot of the, you know, either Nazis or people who'd been affiliated with the Nazi Party who'd melted back into life. And yes, there was a lot of silence for, you know, a generation or so about that. And, you know, that never happened, that never eventuated. So that silence is something that has significantly tainted Heidegger's reputation. What was the other thing that I wanted to pick up on from what you had said? Oh yeah, just in terms of Paul Celan and his biography. Yes, I mean, he was haunted by you know, what had happened, and his mental health deteriorated significantly, and he was fixated on whether or not you know, anything from reviews of his work that he thought the reviewers might be connected to neo-Nazism. You know, he was really extremely worried about what wasn't being said. So that's a really significant point as well. And I'll show you just at the end, the last slide I've got there is a book which, if you're interested, you should read it. I can hold it up too. This is a book that I was talking about, John Felsen's. I'll just show you the slide. That's easier. That's John Felsen's biography of Paul Celan, poet, survivor, Jew. So I mean, that, you know, on the things that you've been thinking about, there's a lot to say, and you would find it there. Yeah, so thanks for those comments.
Thank you, George. Robert, your turn.
Yeah, I just want to quickly mention that the German for orchid, this particular flower is called a Geflecktes Nabenkraut. And so it's just a spotted orchid, right? And but what's interesting is that Nabenkraut, that is a reference to it, the words mean a boy's weed, and it's referring to adolescent genitalia, male genitalia. So this is just a reference to the woman who mentioned that orchid. She made her allusion to the Greek sense of orchid. And the reason that I was dwelling on this is because I was wondering, how does orchid, what kind of symbolic value does orchid have if the first two flowers mentioned are medicinal in some way? Then why would he make why would he use the image of these orchids? And I think the orchids represent when they're out walking, right? There's
Mm.
Celan and Heidegger walking together singly. For some reason, he mentions that they're singly walking together side by side, and they're referred to as orchids. Like, why would he choose? What would the orchid symbolize, I wonder?
My understanding of this, although again, this is you know, a critical view that seems seems possibly right to me, but I'm not, you know, I don't feel like I can give any definitive interpretation. But the critical view that I've heard on that is that the orchid is a flower that grows on its own. And so you know, it's possible that what Celan meant to do was to show that there were these two figures, himself and Heidegger. They had a lot, you know, in common, or that's not the right way of putting it, but they had a certain interest in one another, but in the end, they were, you know, really unable to commune on the thing that was most sort of important to Celan. So there's this sense of them being together, but also not together, like being together, but, you know, being also apart. So that's one interpretation that I've heard. And that seems possible to me. I don't know, and if anyone else has any other thoughts, that'd be interesting to hear, because I think that's a good question. Like it's quite a different image from the two earlier images of the flowers, the arnica and the eyebright. And you know, the fact that singly is also specifically put there probably gives a bit of weight to that interpretation.
Yeah, I thought there was maybe something else in the Greek that would be opposed to the medicinal qualities of the first two flowers, maybe something in contrast or whatever, you know.
Yeah, that's a good question. Not that I know of, but yeah, I mean, that would be something to look further into. Celan would have known, of course. Like like I mentioned earlier, his botanical knowledge was encyclopedic. So you have to think that I mean, you obviously have to assume that for whatever reason he's chosen that particular image, you know, it's very deliberate and it goes all the way down. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. If
There's one thing I just noticed. I'm just Googling this, and it just I just found this reference. In ancient Greece, orchids were associated with virility, and Greek women believed that if the father of their unborn child ate large new orchid tubers, the baby would be a boy. So, for whatever that's worth, I don't know.
Seems to be a lot of let's say maleness around that, you know, around that image, and that's not something that I had been aware of before. So I can't think that that's totally, you know, insignificant. I'm not sure if it's how deliberate, but I can't think it's insignificant. Yeah, I don't know. Those are really interesting thoughts, though.
Especially because the German, that's like the, you know, the German common term for the word actually refers to, you know, a boy's genitalia, like explicitly in the German. So
yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'll put a pin in that for further thought.
Well, thank you, Robert. Sean, your turn.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I'm not sure how well this is going to be taken, but I do think there's a lot of sex jokes going on in the text here. And in interest of elucidating that point, I'm looking at the intertextuality between this poem and the film Clerks by Kevin Smith. Has anyone seen this film?
So long ago, I can't remember very much about it. You'll have to explain your references there.
Okay, yeah. So at the beginning of the film, the clerk is woken up and he's not even supposed to be there today. Arnica, eye bright, draft from the well with the star die on top, right? in the convenience store. Written in the book. Whose name did it record before mine? 36? I'm 37? I don't think anyone's catching the intertextuality.
Not really. Sorry.
It's been a long time since anyone's seen this film. Thinker's word come to heart. That's where Randall enters. I don't appreciate your ruse. Then the Orcus and Orcus singly, that is definitely a dick joke. That is 100% a dick joke. I'm sorry. I'm just explaining how I interpret the poem, and also I'm using intertextuality. Raw exchanges while driving. Randall! No one remembers that film. The Mensch, no one remembers that part. I'm not even supposed to be here today.
All right, Sean, I think that that's a paper for you. I think you will be the first critic, the first person to interpret this poem in relation to clerks in relation to sex jokes. I say go for it.
I wouldn't be surprised if Kevin Smith was aware of this program.
I'm going to have to watch Clerks again and have a look at this poem and see if I can work out what you're talking about, because I haven't got you. Sorry. But yeah, yep. I don't know what else to say. Except let's just not get to humidity much, okay? Let's leave that well and truly alone. In you.
Elle, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that orchids, along that line, are depend on highly acidic, well, not highly acidic, but acidic water. So they're acidic plants or flowers, and which would maybe fit in with the satire. Also, orchids are used in Ayurveda and Chinese medicine to reduce stress. The tubers are ground into a powder, which is, can be placed in food or drink or whatever, and it's supposed to relax you and improve your mood.
Mhm.
So kind of plays into the whole thing. Sex, your mood,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, possibly just generally the medicinal use of plants as well. But yeah. I don't know. You never know. I mean, I'm not owning an interpretation. So yeah. And I do think it's interesting, that Orcus and Orcus. Yeah. It's given me a view of the poem that I must admit, thought about before. Now, I just want to say a couple of quick things. Can I do that just before we sort of get towards the end? Because there are just one or two, I think, things that we should probably pick up on. These are just things that, have sort of been often talked about in interpreting this poem, apparently. And Sean, I think it was, might know about this. The word that's translated as log here, I probably can't even pronounce that, nuful, means bludgeon, or can mean bludgeon. So there's a word play there which doesn't come through in English. And there are a few other ways, like with the yellow and the star dye, possibly the forest sward unleveled, that has led a lot of critics to read this as quite a scathing sort of indictment, I suppose, on Heidegger and on, Heidegger's non-response to Celan and his failure to ever address his Nazi past. And it's also often been read as really a kind of a record of a deep break and disappointment that Celan felt upon meeting Heidegger, and, you know, whatever exchange took place between them, and Heidegger's incapacity to follow through on what Celan had hoped for. This section here in the Hutte, I just see if I can find it. Again, this is a German thing, so it was not something that I had a direct understanding of, but Heidegger's cabin, that little cabin that I showed you there, Heidegger's cabin, he called it his Denkerhütte, which literally translates to thinker's hut, somewhat facetiously, according to the translators. His wordplay on the thinker's cabin, Celan's wordplay, therefore, on the thinker's cabin, calling it the Hutte, because Hutte, or a hut in German, is usually associated with the poor, whereas, you know, thinking is the domain of the educated. So, you know, another interpretation is that Celan's having a bit of a go at Heidegger here by calling his thinker's hut, you know, just a Hutte. And yeah, so, you know, is he accusing Heidegger of pretentiousness there? So there are lots of ways that interpreters and scholars have kind of picked through this poem and tried to show how much it documents Celan's disappointment with Heidegger. And also, just quickly, Celan wrote this poem very soon after their meeting, and then he had it printed and he sent a copy straight to Heidegger. And again, I think there was another line in the poem initially, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it was something like that would have been translated into English as, here in this section, the line about a hope today for a thinker's forthcoming, for a thinker's word to come. And there was something added that indicated that Celan expected Heidegger to come through and speak publicly as a result of this meeting. So that was the version that Celan had printed and sent to Heidegger. And Heidegger wrote a thank you note in reply that was pretty kind of just didn't seem to pick up you know, what it was that Celan was really trying to say. It was sort of like, yeah, a bit of a just thanks for the poem, that's great. And so when the poem was eventually published, that extra bit was taken out by Celan, which commentators have taken to indicate that he had realized and come not to expect anymore that Heidegger would come through, would follow through. So whether there was, you know, whether Celan asked him to speak publicly, whether Heidegger, you know, replied, and in what way he replied, is not known. Yeah, that was just something that I thought would be worth filling in before we leave the poem.
Well, thank you, Desmond. I think we've run out of questions and comments.
Well, let me just show you. This is the very last. So as we know, Celan suicided in 1970 after a long spell of mental illness, and upon his death, a book was found in his study with. And this is from Holderlin's poetry, and this line was underlined: "Sometimes the genius goes dark and sinks down into the bitter well of his heart." So yeah, very amazing poet with a very but very sad life. And I'll just put this up just quickly. This is quite interesting. This is John Felsenner's really fantastic biography. This book here, Paul Celan and Martin Heidegger, An Unresolved Conversation, is literally an entire book about their papers and the exchanges that they had. This radio show, I'll just pop that in the chat if you want the link. That is a really interesting, I can't find the chat now because I'm on share. There we go. It's in comments. Sorry, just while I mess around with the technology. All right, just give me a second I'll just finish saying what I'm saying, and then I might stop sharing while the last two people are talking. I can throw these into the chat. So that one there is a really good podcast that's a discussion with John Felsner. And there's also a radio play by John Banville about this meeting, in which John Banville imagines Celan and Heidegger, and also Hannah Arendt is a character in that radio play, and that's really worth listening to as well. So I can see there's a couple more hands, and let me just try and work out while you're talking how I can get this into the chat. Can I stop share and just
Yes,
do it that
sure.
way?
Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm not. I've been on Zoom for like everyone for the past several years, but I still don't know what I'm doing.
So shall we get John to comment now?
Yes, please do. Yep.
Go ahead, John. John, go ahead.
I can't unmute.
You are now unmuted.
Oh, I am now. Yeah, I just looked up in my dictionary. It's interesting that FAD, P-F-A-D, certainly means path or a lane, but it's also connected with the Boy Scout movement as Finder. A pathfinder then becomes the Boy Scout, or Finder in the Girl Guide, and it's very much connected, Bund, with the Boy Scout Association. So it has quite a wide, or can have quite a wide application, actually personalised in the group. And the other one is very difficult. The Knuppel is a club, cudgel, truncheon, a sculptor or carpenter's mallet, a billet of wood, round timber log, wire bar, and so it is the where it says Knuppelbrücke, that's a rustic bridge. So perhaps a good translation would be rustic path or something like that for
Yeah,
for the
great.
poem.
Thanks for that. That's really
But there's quite a lot of choices. It has here Knuppel holts, that's logs or faggots, and so they're all these words. You can see the connections, but it is a matter of just applying which aspects you want to. Anyway, that's just from my German dictionary that I've got here.
great. Thank you.
Good, thanks, John. Elle, your turn.
Oh, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I had a few thoughts come to mind. One is just if this wasn't covered, suicidality being prohibited in Jewish religion.
Right.
So that excuse me, that act, sealing the deal in terms of alienation, I would wonder. Then also a reference was made about historical context and as it relates today. And of course, Palestinians had some Palestinians in leadership with the Balfour Agreement had allied themselves with Nazi Germany because they considered Jews threatening, with the UK, with Britain giving homeland or offering homeland. So it's a very complex history, and Nazism in the early Palestinian movement too. So I didn't know if any of that is really relevant here, but just because it was brought up, I thought I'd explain that context. And also similar echoes to today, where basically atrocities of Israel are constantly focused on, but zero atrocities of Hamas killing the people they're governing for many years. It seems to not get any attention at all. And I think it's in so many other atrocities, like I think about Ukraine, the dismemberment of people, Russia targeting civilians with drones and other atrocities. They get so little notice, as well as maybe 6 or 7 other genocides in the world. So it really does matter what border you live in to get attention. And I can understand his upset about the lack of humanity. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I hope that, yes, this poetry is out of the life of Paul Celan, and it's a response to the Shoah. It's a response to the world after the Second World War. But, you know, it's a very human poetry, and I hope that Celan can be, and I think he should be read like that. So, you know, yes, all of the things you said, the atrocities continue in many different ways and in complex ways and in ways that complexly relate to this historical situation. Yeah.
Thank you, Elle. Muri, go ahead. Muri. Yoo-hoo. Try again. Muri, unmute. No, maybe. Oh, yes.
Okay. So can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I want to commend. I want to commend. I would like to commend the presenter for the outstanding presentation. Her clarity of thought, engaging delivery, and in-depth.
Muri might have frozen, or maybe we've lost him.
I was just about to thank him for his kind words.
Oh, well.
I just put in the chat the title and author of the biography that I've leaned quite heavily on, Paul Celan, Poet Survivor Jew by John Faulkner. That's a really high recommendation. And he you know, it's a biography, but it's a very poetic biography. So he talks, you know, central to this book is the poetry, and Faulkner talks a lot as he works through the different times of Celan's life and the poetry itself. He talks a lot about the translation and the way that he has translated Muri's back. So anyway, that's a recommendation if you're interested in reading a bit more.
Yes, we've had a message from the chat. Oh, there's Muri. Okay, unmute yourself, Muri.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry. It's my internet connection that is misbehaving.
Yes, we
So,
can.
like I said, all right, I would like to commend the presenter for the outstanding presentation. I said her clarity of thought, the engaging delivery, and the in-depth knowledge of the subject really captured my attention. My question is, given Heidegger's refusal to confront his Nazi past, do you think Celan's decision to meet with him and later write Todnesburg, the poem, inadvertently legitimizes his work? Or does it mean he glosses over the philosopher's complicity? How do you think Celan reconciled the tension between Heidegger's ideas and his personal history? Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it's such a big question too. I think that for Celan, his whole, like his interest in Heidegger was deeply fraught. I think what Celan wanted to know was that Heidegger's dalliance, let's call it, you know, as a bit of a euphemism with Nazism was like that. I think what Celan wanted to know was that in his later life, Heidegger understood that as completely mistaken. I think Celan wanted to know that he didn't have anything deeply to do with Heideggerian philosophy. I think Celan at different times, and this is part of what gives rise to the very different readings of this poem. The other book that I mentioned, which is called Celan, Heidegger, and Paul Celan and Martin Heidegger, An Unresolved Conversation. details quite a lot. The meeting itself, it details some of the letters that Celan wrote to various different people, including his wife, following that meeting. And it seems like as he thought about it more, he became more distressed. Celan was highly distressed by Heidegger and by his past, but he was also really interested in his philosophy. And I think that was a difficulty that Celan was never really able to resolve. Now, my conjecture is, so because I think it's interesting, or not interesting, but, you know, I mean, Heidegger's philosophy, like we all know about Heidegger's Nazi past. And in fact, we know a lot more about it than Celan did because of the black notebooks that were published, I think, in the 1990s. I've got that written down somewhere. But anyway, more came to light, you know, after Heidegger's death about about how central Nazism in fact was to his philosophy, much more central than was understood at the time. And I actually think that if Celan had have known that, I don't think he would have corresponded with Heidegger, and I don't think he would have met with him either. Actually, that's my opinion. Other people don't agree with me about that, but because, you know, because of the history, because of who Celan was, because he was so, I mean, it seems ridiculous to say sensitive about Nazism because he was a Holocaust survivor. Like that's, you know, almost something that doesn't need to be said. But his mental health and the deterioration of his mental health and his, you know, like, I mean, he was really obsessed constantly about whether people had Nazi past, you know, what that past was, how neo-Nazism was sort of, or how Nazism was coming back in the form of neo-Nazism. So I don't think, to answer your question, that Celan's relationship with Heidegger legitimizes Heidegger at all. And I think Celan might have worried a bit about that himself, as I said, because it was so fraught. But it is a thing that, you know, Heidegger is enormously influential as a philosopher, and we're still reading him, we're still talking about him, and we don't talk very much about it. Like his Nazism is something that is parked to the side most of the time. And I think that is, you know, problematic. And I think that is something that that, you know, maybe philosophers need to do better about and need to more deeply understand, you know, the relationship that Nazism had to Heidegger's philosophy centrally. So yeah, that's a short answer to a very good and very big question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for asking that. Well,
Yes,
thank you very much for having me, everyone. Like, I've really appreciated being asked to come and talk. And yeah, it's been, I don't know, I picked a pretty hard topic. I'm sorry about that. If I come back next time, I'll talk about something a little bit lighter. But I also think, yeah, you know, these poets like Celan who really can help us get to the core of our humanity, I think that's really something really important. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Desmonda Lawrence, for your presentation on poetry and philosophy, Heidegger and Paul Celan.